In this module, we shall discuss about general agreements on tariffs and trade. 250 years ago, the father of economics, Adam Smith, wrote in his famous publication An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations on the Causes of International Trade. Since the great work of Adam Smith, economists have sought answers to a number of questions relating to international trade theory and its application, such as why do countries trade with one another? How do countries determine and regulate the trade in goods? Since the work of pro-market classical economists like Adam Smith to ongoing current regime of trade liberalization, global leaders has pushed for the reform of international trade regime and liberalization of trade rules and regulation for the promotion of international trade. In the aftermath of World War II, the need of international institutions in the area of finance, trade and international affairs was greatly felt and later realized in the form of UNO, IBRD, IMF and GATT. The formation of General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade (GATT) in 1948 was a milestone in the direction of trade liberalization. After starting this module, you shall be able to understand the background and condition of the formation of multilateral trade negotiation body GATT, the progress of international trade liberalization in the form of different rounds of GATT and later formation of WTO, objectives and functions of WTO. First, we shall discuss the background of GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was set up on 30/10/1947 by 23 founder member countries to deal with the issues of tariff restrictions on import and export of goods by member countries under a multilateral umbrella. Post Second World War, the United Kingdom, the United States and other allied nations indulged in negotiation series to create post-war international economy rules. This resulted in the establishment of International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in July 1944, Bretton Woods Conference and the signing of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade at an international conference in Geneva in October 1947. It came into effect in 1st January 1948 with 23 founding members becoming the contracting parties. This was one of the international institutions originally planned as International Trade Organization (ITO) along with the other two Bretton Woods institutions, namely IMF and World Bank. The Havana Charter, which promised to pave the way to ITO, was rejected in 1948 because US particularly felt that global framework of commerce and trade may come in the way of its hegemony over global trade. GATT 1947 is now replaced by GATT 1944. GATT 1947, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade of October 1947, was annexed to the first act of the second session of the Preparatory Committee of the UN Conference on Trade and Employment. It came into force in January 1948 as a provisional agreement and was the contract that provided the international trade rules until the end of the Uruguay round in December 1993, when it became part of the WTO structure. GATT 1994. GATT 1994 is one of the several agreements establishing the WTO. It includes the provisions of the GATT 1947 before the entry into force of the WTO agreement and protocols on tariff concessions, protocols of accession and decisions on waivers, special understandings and the Marrakesh Protocol to GATT 1994. GATT rounds. Since the formation and its replacement by WTO, the GATT provided the rules and regulations for much of world trade during 5 decades. But throughout those 47 years, it was a provisional agreement till 1994. The transition from GATT 1947 to GATT 1994 has undergone through 8 rounds of multilateral trade negotiations among member nations. Next is objectives of GATT. With the reduction of tariff barriers and removing inequity in international trade, the GATT targets at: first, international trade expansion; second, increasing world production which results in full employment in the participating nations; third, developing and fully utilizing world resources; and lastly, fourth, improving standard of living of the communities on a global level. Moving on to the GATT rounds. The contracting parties, as termed in GATT to member nations, met at regular intervals to negotiate agreements to reduce quotas, tariffs and trade restrictions and related international matters during 1948 to 1994 of different rounds of GATT negotiations. The GATT recognized that tariffs are the main impediments to the growth of international trade. Therefore, first 5 rounds prior to Kennedy round were centered on the negotiations on tariff reduction. The first round was at Geneva in 1947, the second at Annecy in 1949, and the third was at Torquay in United Kingdom in 1950-51. The fourth round of GATT was held in Geneva in 1955, 56 and 5th, once again at Geneva in 1960-62, called Dillon round. Let us throw some light on the contents and essence of each GATT round in brief. The different rounds of GATT has been discussed. Column-wise year, location, number of member countries and their focus and outcome of each trade negotiations has been given in detail. Until the 5th round of GATT, member nations aimed to conversion of quantitative restriction into tariffs and thereafter reduction of tariffs gradually. The reformed negotiations under GATT, called Kennedy round negotiation on tariff reduction up to 50% by industrialized nations on non-agriculture product, agreed by Trade Negotiation Committee of participating nations in 1964. In March 1965, the Trade Negotiations Committee took up the procedures for negotiations on agriculture. By September 1965, all developed nations tabled their offers. On account of internal difficulties, the EEC, however, tabled their offers in 1966. Similarly, a plan for the participation of the LDCs was also adopted by the Trade Negotiations Committee in March 1965. The overall results in Kennedy rounds were very substantial and of a magnitude larger than any such multilateral negotiation in the past. However, the developing countries remained unsatisfied by the Kennedy round as their trading problems did not receive the attention and priority they deserved. The trade negotiations in Kennedy round were concentrated largely on products of major export interest to the developed nations, to the neglect of the export needs of the developing countries. The 7th round of GATT negotiations were held at Tokyo during 1973-1979. The major issues discussed were removal of non-tariff barriers, reducing tariffs, and trade liberalization in agriculture sector. In Tokyo round of trade negotiation, several agreements relating to subsidies, countervailing duties, technical barriers, dairy products, customs valuation, import licensing procedures, trade in civil aircrafts, bovine meat, and government procurement were concluded. The 8th round of multilateral trade negotiations of the GATT participants, commonly known as Uruguay round, was launched at Punta del Este in Uruguay, Latin America in September 1986 in a special session, and after 8 years of comprehensive discussion concluded on the 1st December 1993 at Geneva. A brief summary of Uruguay round negotiations is presented below in table. In sum, the early years, the GATT trade rounds concentrated on reducing tariffs. Then, the Kennedy round in the mid-60s brought about a GATT anti-dumping agreement. The Tokyo round during the 70s was the first major attempt to tackle non-tariff barriers and to improve the system. The 8th, the Uruguay round of 1986-94 was the latest and most extensive of all. It led to formation of the WTO and a new set of agreements. Now, we shall discuss the global trade and negotiation rounds of the GATT. In the post-war era, under the disguise of GATT, both economists and politicians are at war in determining the future of the global economy. The GATT in theory only makes a tall claim of treating all contracting parties as equal, but in practice, however, the poor and small countries are ignored and never allowed to succeed in asserting themselves. Next, we move on to the WTO, its origin, objectives and functions. The WTO officially came into being in January of 1995 and led to the replacement of General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade (GATT), which was there since 1948, post Second World War. Prior to WTO dynamism to initiate something similar to International Trade Organization (ITO) occurred. However, ITO treaty was not given approval by the US and a few other countries and finally could not come into effect. In 1980s, as the globalization spread with the expansion of trade and business, it became obvious that GATT was not constructed to serve huge number of new arising challenges surrounding global trading, with this event comprising biggest trade negotiating on record initiated in 1986. It was called as Uruguay Round, occurred in Punta del Este, Uruguay. World Trade Organization is a member-driven organization where decisions are taken by a process of negotiations amongst the member countries based on rules contained in the agreement establishing WTO. Next is Marrakesh Agreement. Marrakesh Agreement established the World Trade Organization on 15 April 1994. Signed by participants in the Uruguay Round 1986 to 1993 during the Ministerial Conference in Marrakesh. All the WTO agreements, including the GATTs, TRIPS and DSU, are integral parts of the Marrakesh Agreement. Origin: WTO was established by 123 member countries that were contracting parties to GATT on 15 April 1994 at Marrakesh and come into effect on 1st January 1995. It deals with international trade in goods, trade in services and trade in intellectual property rights. Meaning of WTO. WTO or the World Trade Organization is a legal body consisting of 148 member nations for multilateral trade agreements on goods and services, including intellectual property rights. It deals with the rules of trade between member nations at a global level. It enjoys privileges and immunities similar to UNO, IMF and World Bank. The WTO came into existence out of negotiations and all the decisions in WTO is the result of negotiations. The major part of negotiations is on the basis of the Uruguay Round and the Doha Development Agenda. The previous organization was General Agreement on Tariff and Trade or GATT. Objective: the main objectives of World Trade Organization are spelled out in the preamble to the Marrakesh Agreement, which are as follows. First, to make sure the tariff reduction and other trade barriers. Second, to remove inequities in international trade relations. Third, to facilitate higher standard of living, full employment, rising amount of real income and an increase in production and trade in goods and services of the member nations. Fourth, to make positive effect which ensures developing countries, especially the LDCs, secure a level of share in the growth of international trade that reflects the needs of their economic development. Fifth, to facilitate the optimal use of the world's resources for sustainable development. And sixth, to promote an integrated, more viable and durable trading system incorporating all the resolutions of the Uruguay Round trade negotiations. Next is functions. The major functions of the WTO are as follows. First, to lay down a substantive code of conduct aiming at reducing trade barriers including TBs and NTBs and elimination of discrimination in international trade relations. Second, To provide the institutional framework for the administration of the substantive code, which encompasses a spectrum of norms governing the conduct of member countries in global trade. Third, to provide an integrated structure of the administration, thus to facilitate the implementation, administration and fulfillment of the objective of the WTO agreement and other multilateral trade agreements. Fourth, to ensure the implementation of the substantive code and settle trade related disputes. Fifth, to act as a forum for the negotiation of further trade liberalization. Sixth, to cooperate with the Bretton Woods institution, that is IMF and World Bank, and its associates for establishing coherence in trade policy making. The three pillars of WTO. First, most favored nation. Most favored nation is one of the essential agreements of all the WTO agreements. It means that equal treatment has to be given to all the member nations by the other member nation in market access for any goods or services. For example, if UK is allowing market access in any particular field of services to USA, it has to give similar market access to India or to any other member country. In other words, there cannot be any kind of discrimination amongst members of WTO. Second, national treatment. National treatment broadly means that the member countries should give equal treatment to domestic goods and services to those given to foreign goods and services. Similarly, there cannot be different treatment to the legal entities whether they are of domestic origin or of foreign origin, with certain limited exceptions. For example, Article 17 on GATTs deal with the national treatment and mandates that members shall not discriminate against any other member in respect of supply of services, and it should be given the same and equal treatment as for domestic suppliers of the same or similar services. Third, market access. Market access is the most essential ingredient of the multilateral trade agreement under WTO. All the various agreements, whether on agriculture or on services under GATTs, talk of market access. Market access means that each member country has to grant free access to market on the principle of most favored nation for supply of goods without any kind of non-tariff barriers and subject to commitments for reduction of tariff on imports with an ultimate target of zero duty regime. There are some safeguards in the form of anti-dumping and countervailing duty with special provisions for developing countries and LDCs for less than reciprocity. However, certain limitations or restrictions or regulations are allowed under GATTs as per Article 16 on market access. Certain exceptions are provided in the following articles of GATT for balance of payment and national security reasons as described. Article 12, GATT balance of payment exception. Article 12 of the GATT provides an exception to Article 11, which prohibits the use of quantitative restrictions QRs for all countries, allowing them to apply QRs when faced with balance of payments BOP difficulties to safeguard their external financial position. Article 21st GATT National Security Exception. Member countries are allowed to use exemptions to GATT obligations where essential security interests are at stake. These may include disclosure of information, actions in pursuance of obligations under the UN Charter, and any action considered necessary for the protection of essential security interest. Security exceptions also exist in the GATT's Article 16th, BIS and the TRIPS Agreement Article 73. Quantitative restrictions QRs. Quantitative restrictions or QR is a kind of protection or a non-tariff barrier for import or export of goods. Although maintenance of quantitative restrictions QRs on import is not permitted as per Article 11th of GATT, the government can, if the situation so warrants, utilize the mechanism of raising the applied tariffs within the bound rates. If such a gap exists, and take measures such as anti-dumping action, safeguard actions and imposition of countervailing duties. There are about 10,500 items under import-export list, of which 8,000 items were in QR before 1991. Today, there are only about 500 items under QR on the ground of environment, security, etc. And rest all items are under Open General License (OGL). In April 1997, there were 2,700 items under QR list under Article 18B of GATT 1994, which allowed it on account of balance of payment problems. However, India lost a case in WTO dispute settlement body and was bound to phase out QRs from April 2001. Next is main agreements of WTO. Replacement of its predecessor GATT by a new multilateral trade institution paved the way for the establishment of World Trade Organization on 15 April 1994 was signed by participants in the Uruguay round 1986-1993. During the ministerial conference in Marrakesh, the emergence of WTO is based on several rounds of trade negotiations and different agreements agreed upon by member nations during decades of multilateral trade negotiations. The agreements of WTO for trade-related goods are General Agreement on Tariff and Trade 1994, Agreement on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures, Agreement on Textiles and Clothing, Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade, Anti-Dumping Measures, Custom Valuation Methods, Pre-Shipment Inspection, Rules of Origin, Import Licensing. Other agreements include trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, TRIPS, which deals with intellectual copyrights comprising of trademarks, copyrights, patents. Trade-related investment measures, TRIMS, serves measures in investment which are related to trade. Agreement on Agriculture (AOA) deals with support to domestically produced goods competing in world market, access to market. General Agreement on Trade in Services (GATT) functions in service-related trade. Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement (TBT) deals with the regulations, testing, standards, certification procedures and ensures that they do not create needless hurdles. The journey of World Trade Organization since its formation has paved the way for reduction of trade barrier, and success in future will depend on balancing power between developed and developing countries with positive discrimination in favor of LDCs while promoting its prime objective, trade liberalization. Let us now summarize what we have learnt in this module. GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was set up on 30/10/1947 by 23 founder member countries to deal with the issues on tariff restrictions on import and export of goods by member countries under a multilateral umbrella. Post Second World War, the United Kingdom, United States and other allied nations indulged in a negotiation series to create post-war international economy rules. With the reduction of tariff barriers and removing inequity in international trade, the GATT targets at first, international trade expansion, second, increasing world production which results in full employment in the participating nations, third, developing and fully utilizing world resources, and fourth, improving standard of living of the communities on a global level. The WTO officially came into being in January of 1995 and led to the replacement of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade (GATT), which was there since 1948 post Second World War. Prior to WTO dynamism to initiate something similar to International Trade Organization (ITO) occurred. WTO, or the World Trade Organization, is a legal body consisting of 148 member nations for multilateral trade agreements on goods and services, including intellectual property rights. It deals with the rules of trade between member nations at a global level. It enjoys privileges and immunities similar to UNO, IMF and World Bank.